Alright, editing geometry within Blender. Okay, now we're going to start down a road of how to insert edge loops, how to extrude, how to keep good geometry. So I have to really first focus on, what's good geometry and what's bad geometry. And good geometry will keep all quads and maintain sculptability later on in different programs. If you're planning on taking anything to ZBrush, you should always have sculptability in mind. That means good uniform geometry. And that's organic. Okay, so organic, you have to keep good uniformity across the mesh in order for it to be sculptable. If it's unorganic geometry, it's a whole different story whatsoever. It's just the basics of, what are you doing with it? Are you going to render it? Are you going to put it in some kind of game engine? Are you just making an illustration, etc. and so forth? So you have to kind of look at how to model based upon what you're doing. Now I'm going to show you some of the basic shapes that you should always kind of start out with when it comes to modeling, and I'll show you how to get started with that in Blender. One is a very, very useful piece of geometry called a squirkle. I call it a squirkle because it's a squared subdivided. So if you go in here, and if you want to make a squirkle, you have to go down here to modifier and go to subsurface. Voila, squirkle. Okay, just like that. And if you want to keep that, you can just apply it. Notice how many modifiers there are. There is a ton of modifiers in here. So if you ever think that, you want to get exploring within Blender, this is the place to start. Okay, so I have this. And why is it so nice? Well, because if I kept doing that, if I went in here and let's say I wanted to sculpt on it, I'll give you a brief demonstration. If I wanted to go into sculpt mode, I can add a multi-res to it, and I can add levels to it. And I'm going to use the Catmull Clark add, and you can see that it's a very uniformed ball. It's got great geometry across it because it's all made out of quads. Now if I started out with something like this, see UV sphere, if I started out with something like this and did the exact same thing, let's say I add some multi-res to it, my machine is now slow. Why? Well, because this is actually being divided several times more on the top than it is in the middle, making it very hard to sculpt on. It's not going to hold as much detail in the center of the object. So I'm going to X that out, go back to my original, and just for entertainment value, let's go into sculpt mode and I'll show you a brief rundown on how sculpt mode works. So sculpt, and I have draw, smooth, pinch, inflate, grab, layer, and flatten. Okay, and then I have the size and strength of the brush, whether I want symmetry on or not, and I got symmetry for all of the X, Y, and Z's, and if I want to lock the axes of my movement across the mesh. Let's take, for example, X symmetry, and I'll start out here and just go like that, and I can hold Alt, click around. Very cool, no doubt, right? You're thinking, wow, that's amazing. Now, it is amazing, and you got to be really careful on what you're doing with it, because if I go like this and I start just hammering on the mesh, it's going to be a very bad mesh later on. So what I want to do is always think ahead and maybe lower my subdivides a little bit. And I can do that by hitting the arrows. And now I can work on it just like that, and using Alt to rotate around it rather quickly. Okay, so all quads means happiness in sculpting worlds. Now, later on, I'll also show you the advantage of using this because you can also build a lot of shapes in non-organic geometry with the squirkle. But for right now, you're probably sculpting and you're probably having a good time. So that is a brief rundown of how sculpt mode works and the squirkle to get you started on good geometry, and you can make some nice head models with this thing. Okay? Enjoy, and that's all for this video. Next we're going to look at a non-organic surface called a brayer. Okay? So hold your hats for that one.